Welcome again. Thank you so much for being here today to be guests of the Vermont Community Foundation. We are thrilled to have you. Please keep eating. I'm so glad. Enjoy the food. It's really pretty amazing. It's so nice to see people greet each other and see old friends as well as make new acquaintances. We're going to start as you start to finish up your lunch. I'm introducing Billy Strauss, who's a co-founder of the Next Stage Arts Project. He's going to talk a little bit about the space that you're in. After that, Dan Smith, our president and CEO, is going to welcome you as well, and then I'll introduce our panelists and we'll get going. So here's Billy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to raise this a little.
6 inches.
My name's Billy Strauss. As Elizabeth said, I'm one of the co-founders of Next Stage Arts Project, which is the organization that calls this building home. Barry Stockwell, who's sitting over there in one of the old church pews, is also a co-founder. So we've been working together there were 5 of us all together at the very beginning. We started about 10 years ago in the church office over there, which is now the main office here, brainstorming about what to do with this old building whose congregation had relinquished it to, at that time, the Putney Historical Society. And some of you probably have been in this space when it was formerly a church. Some of you may have been. And by the time the congregation disbanded, it was in really rough shape, as is not uncommon, I think, with a lot of our church structures in Vermont, if and when they fall into disuse or the congregation closes down. And so this one, in this case, as many are, located right in the center of the village, had become, or was destined to potentially become sort of a little bit of an eyesore and sort of not a good testament to what happens when old buildings are no longer cared for. So at the same time, this group came together and hatched a vision for how to think about adaptively reusing this beautiful space that had been for 150 years, and the building was built in 1841, a real hub of the community in Putney, and a place where people came together to celebrate and mourn, and for all the kinds of rituals that happen in these spaces. So the idea was hatched to turn it into essentially an arts-based community center and community hub. And if you have a chance before you leave, the theater is actually upstairs, and that was the old sanctuary, and we did a major renovation 2015-16, which included completely rehabbing that space and turning it into the theater it is today, and also redoing this space and turning it into the space you're sitting in, and we put in a beautiful kitchen, and et cetera. So a lot of what goes on in this space is on the stage upstairs. We have lots of shows, about 70 to 80 events a year up there. Literature, theater, music, sort of everything, and it's year-round. And then at the same time, we have a tremendous amount of programming that happens off the stage, in the community, with the schools, bringing students from the Putney Central School into the building to experience arts events and cultural events that are not really accessible to them at school. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the 10-year history of this project. We are just next year celebrating our 10th, which is exciting. We're doing a new strategic plan and sort of visioning what the next 10 years will be. But we're very excited about everything that we've accomplished. And when Elizabeth reached out about this event, we talked about the fact that it seemed kind of apropos to be hosting a conversation along the lines of what today's conversation will be in a building that had always been at the center of spiritual life, and kind of how that manifests in the modern era. So thank you very much for being here, and if anybody wants to see the theater before you leave, just chase me or Barry down. It's actually open, and there's an elevator, so you can walk up or take the elevator up, and we're very happy to have you here.
Next, I'd like to introduce Dan Smith, the president and CEO of the Community Foundation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And actually, I have to confess, I was having a bit of nostalgia coming in, because I realized the last time I was here in this building, I was with Martha O'Connor, who was chairing the board of trustees for the Vermont State College at the time, and we did the graduation program for the Vermont Technical College nursing program in Brattleboro and Springfield upstairs using that stage. So in terms of a history of ritual, and those of you who don't know Martha, she recently passed, and it's a great loss. She was a wonderful mentor. So I had that reflection when I came back in the door. So I'm grateful for the chance to be here and talk with you all and listen on this subject. I've been at the Community Foundation for about 3 years, and as many of you know, we've been focusing our work and our energy on an exploration of how we help stitch community back together by closing the opportunity gap that exists in Vermont, which is the set of circumstances that inform the lived experiences of young Vermonters in rural communities around economic, civic, and social experience. And realizing that fundamentally we experience so many things differently, and it's really hard for us to rebuild the structures of empathy and healthy communities around those, that we believe there's a role for a community foundation to play in that. And it's easy for somebody like me, who's kind of a wonk and get sucked up in data, around the challenges facing young people today and challenges facing rural communities. It's easy to lose sight in that space of the fact that closing the opportunity gap and stitching community back together isn't just an exercise in data. It's also an exercise in art, and it's an exercise in spirituality, and the idea that when we bring people together, we build habits, and the ideas that we care for our neighbors and we care for our neighbors' kids are not just affected and informed and motivated by science, but they're motivated by a long legacy of history and religion and spirituality, like I said. So I'm really thrilled to be having this conversation here and to listen to these speakers, and I'm thrilled to be part of an organization that can bring people together in a space like this to have a conversation like this about philanthropy and faith. So thank you very much for joining us today. I want to thank Elizabeth for pulling it together, and I want to thank also in advance our panelists for their thought and care in thinking about today. So, thank you.
Yeah. Welcome again. So I'm really looking forward to introducing the panelists. On your table is a little bit more about them, so I'm going to give a little bit shortened version because they are all 4 people with such incredible experience and backgrounds. But I want to give you some highlights. Starting at one end of the table, we have Rabbi Michael Cohen, who received ordination from the Reconstructivist Rabbinical College and was the first rabbi for the Israel Congregation of Manchester, where he is a rabbi emeritus. Rabbi is on the faculty of Bennington Colleges, where he teaches conflict resolution, and with the college's Center for the Advancement of Public Action. He was also the founding faculty of the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies, co-founded the Green Zionist Alliance, and co-founded the Avara Power Company. I also want to introduce, next we have Alisa Del Tufo, who received her Master's of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary as the recipient of their Distinguished Alumna Award. Alisa works to end violence in the lives of women and girls, promote criminal justice reform, and address racism and other deep social challenges. She's been the founder of 3 nonprofits: the Sanctuary for Families, which was the first organization in New York City to provide assistance to survivors of domestic violence; Connect, which was a group that partners with nonprofits to develop and design culturally relevant programs; and Threshold Collaborative, which is based in North Bennington, which uses narrative to connect people through shared values to encourage inclusion and support individual, collective insight and empathy. And the Reverend Dr. Lise Sparrow, right here, who is the pastor of Guilford Community Church, which is the United Church of Christ, where she's led the congregation for 20 years. She is a doctorate in culture, language, and literacy from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where her doctoral dissertation was focused on identity issues of multicultural women. She was ordained as a United Church of Christ pastor, having studied at both the Harvard Divinity School and Hartford Seminary. And here, immediately to my left, is Cheryl Wilfong, who completed the Integrated Study and Practice Program at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies and graduated as a Community Dharma leader, sponsored by the Spirit Rock Meditation Center. Cheryl also has a master's degree in counseling psychology from Antioch University, New England, with a concentration in mindfulness. Many of you know she also discovered gardening around the same time, and she's a Vermont Master Gardener, a Vermont Master Composter, and the author of Meditative Gardener, which is an award winning of 7 book awards. and it has a wonderful blog called The Meditative Gardener. So quite a panel. I'm very excited to bring them together here today. Now, you may wonder, why this panel? Why did we bring this together? And it really emerged as so many things, an interest of the Community Foundation was talking to our fund holders and donors. When we talk with a prospective donor or somebody we work with regularly, and we ask them what motivates them to give, so often the conversation goes to their beliefs and their values. Right? That's what motivates giving. And that's really not surprising, because if you look at what are the predictors of giving, yes, wealth and income and education have a factor, but the faith and spiritual practice is actually the biggest predictor of charitable giving. It also, if those who are involved in faith communities tend to volunteer more, they tend to give more, and they tend to give more often. And they give to faith-based projects, but they often give to secular projects as well. And when we look at the grants that we make as a community foundation and that our fund holders make, you see that line of those beliefs and values. And you see it across the different kinds of projects that people fund, whether it's serving those in deep need, whether it's building places for reflections and healing, whether it's supporting social action for social change, or whether it's responding to attacks that take place on either individuals or groups or faith communities. And so for us to bring you together to have that conversation meant a lot. So our goals for today are pretty straightforward. We hope, we know, you will be inspired by our panelists, by their beliefs and values and how that has driven them to action and the actions that they have taken. We're also going to take some time to have some reflective time. So we're going to ask the panelists questions, but at a few times, we're going to take a few breaks and invite you to talk at your tables a little bit more about the issues that we're talking about. So this really is a conversation, not a one direction panel. So without further ado, I want to jump into the panel and have a chance to hear from the great group. Let me start by the importance of charity, or tzedakah, or dana, is shared across many spiritual traditions. But what we know is there are nuances in what they mean. In philanthropy, we talk about giving or taking action. So I want to set up the conversation today by learning about how you, our panelists, think about how you and your faith defines acts of charitable good. Do you want to start, Rabbi Cohen?
Okay, thank you. So first of all, thanks to Elizabeth, Billy, and Dan, and thank you all for coming, and these wonderful panelists who I've met and some way even teach with apparently at Bennington College, and we didn't even know each other, but that's another, small is not always intimate, as we've learned in this world. But anyhow, so in Judaism, we don't use the word charity, we use the word tzedakah, which comes from the word tzedek, which is righteousness. That is what we label in English as charity, we see as bringing more justice and righteousness into the world. It's not an option, it's a commandment to do tzedakah. And so that kind of really informs that the question is not, will I, but how will I? That's the starting point in Judaism when it comes to tzedakah. Its origins actually are not about money, it's about food. Because when all of these laws were originated thousands of years ago, it was a agrarian agricultural society, and food was literally the staple, and in more ways than one. And so there was the tithing system that many of us are familiar with, but there was also something in the fields called peah, where you would leave the corner of the field for the poor, leket, anything that dropped, and shichicha, anything that you forgot, and you could not go back and get that. And those who were not as fortunate could then take that food. You may remember there's a famous episode in the book of Ruth where that takes place, but it gives dignity back to the person who's receiving, because they're participating in the harvest. And that's a really, really powerful message in terms of framing what it means to give to those who are less needy. Never forget also that they have dignity as well, and to give them that opportunity in the process.
Thank you, that was nice. So I'm Alisa, and I don't fit very neatly into any particular faith community. As I was saying earlier at lunch, I'm kind of one of those seeker people, and I I would say that the sort of stream I'm in has been most influenced by Mahayana Buddhism and Christianity. I was born and raised Catholic, and I think that's one of the reasons why Mahayana Buddhism was sort of appealing. It's sort of the Catholic, in my opinion, it's sort of the Catholic version of Buddhism, in a strange way. I could talk more about that later if you'd like to hear my thoughts on that. But I think for me, the issues that rise to the surface in all faiths, and I guess for me, I've been thinking a lot about this presentation for the last week or so because I haven't had the chance to really talk about my faith or faith very much recently. And one of the things I think about faith is that it's the sense of certainty in things that are uncertain, having a confidence, a commitment to something that you're not at all able to prove, except in your own heart. And so for me, my faith is that we're all connected as human beings in this world, and that we're all connected to the natural world as well. And that the idea in Christianity of beloved community and the term Ubuntu in African traditions are very important to me because they emphasize not the divisions between us, but the absolute interconnectedness of all creatures on the planet. The idea of being a bodhisattva in Buddhism also encompasses that belief system, and the idea that we are placed on this planet to care for one another and to care for the planet is basically the kind of core belief system that I have, and one that I find is true in all the faiths that I've either experienced personally or learned about through others. So that's the place I come from, and I'm happy to share that and more as the day goes on. Thank you.
So inspiring. Thank you to everybody. I was very blessed to grow up most of my childhood in Berkeley, California, and also was an exchange student, and also studied abroad, and also taught at SIT, which is now almost defunct, but for 30 years, which is School for International Training, which and did their I taught intercultural communication courses. So by nature, I've lived with diversity all my life, and I'm fascinated by it. But about 20 years ago, I listened to the Dalai Lama, who said, if you have to choose one path, choose the one you were born into. So I reeled back all these tendrils that had been going out in different directions and claimed Christianity. And for those of you who know this, we pretty much have, as Rabbi said, commandments, and ours in Christianity is to seek Christ in everyone, and specifically as far as charity, to get to that, we have the quote which is familiar to all of you, I'm sure. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you visited me. So very specific. And in my mind, I need to do all of those things. And in doing those things, I find God. So the more specific my broad mind can be of meeting each person in each circumstance is the closer that I come to God. And so in a church, it's pretty easy to do that, as we find circumstances and we meet them, and we'll talk about that later, but that would be sort of my starting gate for today.
Thank you. So I grew up in the Christian tradition, but bailed out as a teenager. And eventually I happened into Insight Meditation, which turned out to be a good fit for me. Insight Meditation is also called the Southern tradition, from the Southern Asian countries of Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka. So Southern tradition is also called Theravadan, meaning the words of the elders. So in a sense, it's the more fundamentalist because it's going directly from the words of the Buddha. And the Buddha taught generosity as the very first practice for householders. We are all householders. And as Rabbi Michael suggested, back there in that agrarian culture, 2,500 years ago, that meant food, giving food to itinerant monks. So that is just simply this generosity, also called dana, D-A-N-A, is the starting place for our practice, even before meditation. We might, those of us who are attracted to meditation and Buddhist practice might think meditation is where it's at, but the first step is generosity, giving. So that's where the practice begins. And as I'll just include one scenario, one memory of mine. I was on a month-long retreat. There was a monk there. Monks and the monastics, monks and nuns, cannot cook their own food. They have to receive the food. One has to offer food to them. So I happened to be in the cafeteria, the buffet line, and nobody else was there. So I just simply touched the table, offered it to the monk, and I felt so much gratitude like roll in from him. It was quite a deeply felt experience. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a great starting point. Actually, it leads us right to the story you just told. I'd love for you to share a personal highlight where you felt this alignment between these values and beliefs you have about what philanthropy should look like and an actual philanthropic action, a project you worked on, an initiative you were part of, something that, or an individual story like that. Lise, would you like to start?
Sure. Can you hear me? I wanted to start briefly with a cautionary tale. I'm going to basically tell a story that has a great victory, but I wanted to just mention one that didn't. You know, congregational churches believe we don't have bishops, we don't have any higher ups. We believe that God, Christ, speaks through the congregation. So we're constantly on the lookout for possibilities and what God might be leading us to do. There was one incident that led one place, which was that one day I went out in the parking lot and there was this little 2-year-old running around. And I was like, whoa, where'd this kid come from? And we had a little daycare next to the church. And somehow this little child had escaped. And I was pretty worried about that. So shortly thereafter, and I did not create this inspection, but an inspection came and that daycare was closed because there weren't enough adults supervising. On the one hand, I was relieved for the sake of the children. On the other hand, it was a terrible thing for Guilford because that was the only daycare that parents had as an option. So roll forward, and the church bought that property once the people had moved away with the intention of starting a childcare. The end of that story is basically that it is still a concrete slab. We'd taken off the mobile home where they had lived, and we just ran into barrier after barrier of first that we were a church and we had to become a 501c3, and by doing that, we faced all sorts of complexities, and it's still sitting there, and there is still no childcare in Guilford. And don't think we didn't try, but it was really a complex one. The other story I will tell is of a woman in my congregation who had not traveled much in her life, but really loved children, had never had children. So she, early on in my ministry, gave us some stock, which was valued at $13,000. And she said, if we could use it for the children of the church to have opportunities to leave Guilford. So we took that very seriously, and each year we would send some child. They've gone to Mexico. We went down to do Katrina relief. We went to St. Croix. We went to Kenya. We actually have quite a big project in Kenya. And ultimately, as she was aging, I really wanted her to have the satisfaction of us working somehow or other with Native Americans, because she was enamored of Native Americans and was always responding to all those envelopes that all of us receive for Native children. So we did research and actually have a trip, which we've done now for 5 years. We always sponsor a few kids. Now that's just her story there, but one of the things that then happened there was that the Standing Rock DAPL pipeline issue came up. And the place we had been going for then at that point 3 years was just upriver from where we had been working with children who were already at risk. And it turned out people actually, I didn't know this at the time, but there were people from the Cheyenne River tribe who actually were some of the first encampments there. That led to the national call to clergy. I don't know that many of you know that, but 600 of us went to Standing Rock at one point and stood there against the Army, the National Guard who were there one day, and then led us into Washington, D.C. to be social activists. And some of my kids who had come from Guilford, who'd never been out of Guilford, who'd been to South Dakota to do service work with these children, ended up in the streets of Washington, D.C. speaking to their senators. And I feel like that's the type of thing that when Elva Pogar gave us $13,000, she could never have imagined, and yet it was something that's meant the world to our church. I would also say one last thing, I know I'm taking a little bit too much time, is that by doing that, people in our community have gotten excited, and we now have a partnership with Insight Photography, which some of you know is another nonprofit. John Willis went with us last year. We've had kids come here. So one little seed of one little gift by one woman who cared about children in Guilford has really had a huge effect. And so thank you to all of you who make those kinds of things possible. Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah. Looking for who else on the panel to lean in? Yeah. Alisa.
As Elizabeth mentioned, the first organization I started was called Sanctuary for Families. And it was called that because it was aimed to be an organization that organized through the religious community to provide safe sanctuary for battered women and their children. So it was overall an effort to sometimes convince faith communities that violence in the family was something that they should be interested in. And you probably have had experiences where some faith communities are over engaged in the community. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean that they are interested in helping pretty much anyone that has a human cause that's of value. And it was therefore very easy to try to convince those faith communities to support our work. There are other faith communities that have a more maybe closed sense of their mission or who their community is. And in addition to that, the issue of violence in the family tends to raise the hairs on the back of the necks of some faith leaders because it requires a certain change of consciousness about gender relationships and power relationships, and sometimes these are not questions that clergy people want to delve into. So it was a really interesting project to try to obviously it was easy to work with the faith community that was interested in social justice issues and willing to kind of take the step into this. And as Elizabeth said also, this was the first domestic violence organization in New York City. So it was, kind of people were really going out on a bit of a limb. I want to acknowledge the incredible generosity and ongoing support of women religious in this work. There were nuns all over New York City that took families into their convents that were dwindling in population, and many of those religious communities looked at that as a potential resource for others in the community, and have taken in women returning from incarceration, have taken in older foster children who are aging out of the system, and in our case, took in survivors of domestic violence with their children. And that's, I think, something that is maybe not talked about that often, and has been a huge, I think, resource in many social justice fields all over the country, and is very important in New York City. As it turned out, we ended up being successful in convincing religious communities overall that this was an important issue. It took a lot of time and effort to do that. I don't think it would be the same battle now, for the most part. And we were provided with enormous amount of time from religious leaders and congregation members who wanted to help what we were doing. A lot of financial resources that allowed us to kind of grow and continue moving forward, but also physical resources like apartments in parish houses that were empty that women and children could live in. We actually built an apartment building with the Catholic Archdiocese in New York City for survivors to live in longer term. So there was an enormous amount of mutual aid that went on. And we also were therefore there for those faith communities to refer their families to when they needed assistance in addressing violence in their families. So it was a very mutually supportive kind of relationship. So.
Thank you. So both my work and my philanthropy with the environment is very much informed by the Jewish tradition. The psalmist wrote, "The world and its contents belong to God." That is, this is all on loan. And if one has that orientation, this is mine and I treat it how I treat it. If someone were to loan me their bottle, I would treat it better. And that's just writ large, we can go with that. There's a wonderful midrash that says that when God created the Garden of Eden, he showed the Garden of Eden to Adam and Eve, and he said, "See how beautiful my works are. I created it. It's the only place for you. If you destroy it, you have no other home." This is wisdom from over 2,000 years ago. And so that informs, the philanthropy that Alison and I do. And in terms of work, was mentioned, I work for something called the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies, which is located on Kibbutz Keturah in Israel. And I divide my time between here and there. I was on the founding faculty in '96 when I had this amazing 11th month sabbatical from my congregation in Manchester. And we train Israeli, Palestinian, including from Gaza, Jordanian and Moroccan students to be environmental leaders for that region. In addition, it's often a study abroad option for students in the United States. UVM has sent us more students than any other university in the United States. Bennington College has an ongoing relationship there. We've had 4 alumni from BBA. The Vermont Congressional Delegation loves us and has been a great support. So I could go on, and we could say that for off table later. But the message about the environment from the tradition is so strong. I teach a course on it, actually, and really informs both my philanthropy and the work that I do.
Talk a little bit about, many people turn to spiritual practice around healing. And I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about the connection between healing and philanthropy. I wonder if, Cheryl, did you want to talk a little about healing?
I think I'll pass.
You'll pass on that. Okay. Just know the work you've done. Anybody else who wants to reflect on the notions of healing, spirituality?
Well,
Alisa, you're looking at me.
Okay. Well, I think in a way that healing is at the core of the work that I've done from the beginning. I guess I sort of define the work I do as finding pathways to help people bring their best forward. And that has for me, that has ended up being through the use of storytelling. And I started as an oral historian doing this and have kind of morphed that into something that's a little bit more usable, because oral history is a wonderful thing, but it has certain limitations, mostly because oral history interviews are very long and they're not always the most usable for other purposes. So the work I have developed what came really in a way by accident, because I got to a point in the work I was doing with survivors that I wanted to expand from doing direct service work to doing more social change work. And when you run an organization, you have to run the organization, and you have to do what the organization is dedicated to doing. And we were there to provide direct assistance to survivors and their children. So I started experimenting with various methods of engaging survivors in trying to learn more about their experiences and what they had to say about what would help them and what would make a difference in the larger world. And long story short, I ended up becoming an oral historian, which seems quite accidental, actually. But it turned into a life-changing experience for me and for the people that for many of the people that I have worked with to gather their narratives. And it has the thing that's so powerful about storytelling is that if the person that is in the relationship that gets developed between the person telling the story and the person asking about the story, that relationship, and again, this will go back to my Catholicism, is very much of a communion between two individuals who are, no matter what their relationship might be in the larger world, which is always filled with, othering and power dynamics and these kinds of things. The relationship that can be developed in the process of a person telling their story to another human being can be one of the most incredibly rich and intimate kinds of experiences you can possibly have. And the impact that connection can have for the two people involved, for the person telling their story, and this is where the healing comes in, it can be an incredibly transformative experience when someone sits with you in a one-on-one situation and is genuinely, deeply interested in hearing what you have to say without a particular ulterior motive. So, for example, I'll just go back to survivors of domestic violence. When they go to get an order of protection, they have to tell the police officer a particular story. It's a slice of a story. When they go to the hospital to get stitches for the wounds they've received, they have to tell a particular story. And often those stories are limited by fear. Because the person is afraid that there will be unintended consequences for telling the larger story. So they select the story that they're going to tell because they need something. If you're doing a really deep oral history with someone or story gathering, the experience is very liberating because the person is not expecting to tell a particular story. They're expected to tell their story, whatever that means to them. And in that process of telling the story, people gain insight into into what's happened to them. The person who's gathering the story, if they're good at what they do, is able to help sort of weave those pieces together that people feel are very disparate in their life. They don't see connections necessarily between things that have happened to them in the past, especially if they're difficult or painful things. But as the observer and participant there, you get to help them see that there are connections between things. And you also help them to reframe challenges and pain and trauma in their life in a way that emphasizes the resilience and strength that they have exhibited in surviving whatever happened to them. And when that experience is done, that person often feels healed, liberated, and interested in doing something for the larger community because they see now that their own life has and has potential impact for a larger social issue. And many of the people that I have done these storytelling projects with not only feel differently about themselves and differently about their experiences, so they go from seeing their experiences of trauma as shameful to seeing their experiences of trauma as something that they have survived and have the possibility of thriving, and that they then are able to turn that energy into something for a larger social good. And many of the people that have been involved in these storytelling projects have then turned their attention towards fixing the problem that they were the subject of. And so it has this sort of, and it is a process of constantly being reframed myself, or the people that do this kind of work. It changes us as well, because it builds this very intense and strong connection and empathy between two individuals who may have very little in common otherwise, except their human nature. So
that's really interesting to hear. And I think about the parallels. The two things I'm hearing, a lot of things I'm hearing in what you say, and one of them is this idea of bearing witness. We're listening to people, we're hearing what their challenges are, and I think we in philanthropy think about too is what is out there. What are the issues going on, and how should we need to understand more what the actual lived experience is to be able to help. But the other piece of what you said about that transformation has to go with not just helping. The charitable gift, the gift of that one piece of food, but it's that idea of transformation, of empowerment, and of actually doing the right thing by that person. And I know there's a lot of concepts of that in faith, and I know, Rabbi Cohen, you and I were talking for a while. Do you want to take off on that a little bit, that conversation? Take it where you want to take it. Yeah. Permission, you're panelists.
Okay,
you take it where you want to go.
So when you first asked this question, you kind of this meeting of healing, compassion, and philanthropy. So I'm going to start with compassion. So Moses up on Mount Sinai, he's getting the second set of tablets. He wants to see God face to face. God says, you can't see my face, but I'll go in front of you. So he says, stand on that rock, and God goes in front of Moses. And at that moment, God reveals God's 13 attributes, Adonai Adonai Rachum V'chanu, that I am the compassionate God. I'm the merciful God. And I love the choreography there. And this is from Rabbi Michael Lerner, that when God says that, Moses is looking over the shoulder of God. That his mercy is about seeing the perspective of somebody else. And it's reinforced in that the Hebrew word for mercy, rachamim, most Hebrew words have a 3-letter root. So in this case, it's resh, chet, mem, or rechem. Rechem is womb. So the connection of womb and mercy, when a woman is pregnant, she is to take into consideration of the other, if you will. And so when it comes to this meeting of healing, compassion, and philanthropy, we really need to take in the needs of the other, not what we think they need. That's how we heal them better, and that's how our philanthropy should be guided. So there's this wonderful kind of meeting of all of them through that word compassion and that choreography on Mount Sinai.
So take us in a little bit different direction. So we think about, there's general agreement, I think, around the faith community about serving the needs of the poor and the importance of doing that. But our society gets a little more divided, a little more uncomfortable when faith communities take more social policy stances, when they take more activism on sort of controversial issues like climate action, immigration, and human rights. I think of a quote by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King: philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice that makes philanthropy necessary. So I wonder what thoughts you have. How do you guide others when mixing that faith-based set of beliefs with social activism?
Actually, Cheryl probably can speak to this as much as I can. She and I have both been very involved with the overflow shelter for the homeless in Brattleboro. One of the things that I'm very conscious of, and I think this speaks directly to yours, and I can be brief, and maybe others have things to say, is that it's very easy to say, oh, there's our basket in the basement, Project Feed the Thousands, everybody bring something. So that's a pretty easy ask. The thing that has become a bridge to what you're talking about for us, and to us actually joining Vermont Interfaith Action, which does do advocacy for legislation, has been actually making meals and serving them at the overflow shelter for the homeless. And that to me, seems to be the place where people are able to make that link. So whether it is people coming on the Sunday afternoon, working with other people and hearing stories about what happens when people get to the shelter and serve, or if it's people actually going and serving, there's some sort of parallel thing that happens that builds this sense of the true story that underlies why that basket is in the basement. It also, I wanted to just, this is a little bit of a cheat because I wanted to just put into what you were all saying is the power of community, that we all, when you're living and working in community, you hear other stories. So I might not be the one listening to the story or telling the story as far as she was talking about, but sometimes in a church community, you see people transform and you realize that you could transform. You see them doing something, you realize you could do something. And I think part of what happens sometimes is just this idea of you have to take these deeper and deeper steps into the reality of what people are experiencing, so that even if not all of us are at the homeless shelter serving the food, that we take deeper and deeper steps into what that reality is. And then we see that person on the street panhandling, and all of a sudden that random panhandler is actually that guy who we saw was being so nice to that woman who, and you just have this sense of a community out there, and of not being quite so decisive about the judgments that you may be making about the poor.
Yeah, and I would like to add that philanthropy, that's philo, the Greek word for love, brotherly love, and anthro, which is man, but we'll take it as human, and men and women. So loving mankind, loving humankind. Nowadays we might expand that beyond to other realms of animals and the planet and such. So, and as we all know, because we've got families, loving mankind and even humankind and loving those close to us means warts and all. And just sort of following on with what Lisa just said, I am doing a genealogy project, which I have two minds about, but I discovered that my grandfather was a hobo around 1900. It's like I am descended from a homeless person. And we are, I venture to say, almost all of us in this room are descended from homeless people who somewhere back there didn't know where they were going to lay their head that night. Even if they were sort of what we nowadays say couch surfing from, the boat to some name or to some relative. It was all unknown for someone back there. So even those warts and all of the philanthropy, it's a challenge.
Looks like you want to sit. Alisa, did you want to say something? I was just looking.
I guess I just want to re-emphasize the importance of, hearing the voice of people where they're at, and trying to use reciprocity in relationships as a kind of key building blocks in philanthropic work, because I feel like, when I did this first oral history, I learned so many things from these women that, despite the fact that I'd already been working in the field for, a decade and a half, I didn't know, because we see a slice, right? And if you expand the slice and really engage with people. And then the other thing is that I've sort of evolved into doing a lot of restorative justice work. And one of the things that I have discovered, although I feel like I also knew this from survivors of domestic violence, is that there's a great well of the ability to forgive in people's hearts. And yet we have many structures for punishment and sort of segmenting or segregating ourselves, but we don't have enough for bringing people together. And so I have found that with restorative justice, which is, in my opinion, is just another form of storytelling, when you ask people how they feel about something, whether they're the harm doer or the person who is harmed, you find that there's a lot of concern for the other, even if it doesn't appear that way. And because we're never asked that question, and because structures are set up to keep people apart, those questions never really get asked, and the possibility of people coming together doesn't exist. So your example of, some people are working in the soup kitchen or the homeless shelter, and they're telling a story about the person who was really nice to the other homeless person, and then you see them on the street. That makes such a huge difference, because then you have the possibility of a relationship with that person. And I just think that it's good to think about ways of building that work from the ground up, where relationships are developed, because I think that for the most part relationships can be the most healing, and they can ignite the kind of change that we all would like to see happen. So.
Yeah, so the question of whether faith community should have a voice in what are some of the divisive issues of the day, and often the clergy are told, keep politics off the pulpit. And my response has always been, well, have you read the Bible? It's all politics. It's not values neutral. It's about action. It's about taking responsibility. The challenge, though, that we who go to religious texts so often is, how is it interpreted? We know, slavery was justified in the Bible, and those who fought slavery justified their actions. And so what becomes the lenses, the filters of how we decide and interpret it, compassion, love, and all of that, which I think is important. Those, though, can be sometimes too objective or subjective, I should say. And I think at the end of the day, to go back to Moses, where he's described as being the most humble person in the world, at the end of the day, we really need to bring humility to the project. And how are we really understanding these texts, and what are they saying about us? What do they say about people we disagree with? And so that, I think, is a really, really important voice that we need to always remind ourselves of in this process.
Well, we're going to take a minute right now and move away from talking as a panel and to talk at your tables. The idea is this is to be a conversation. And so there's been a lot of ideas put on the table by our panelists right now. So if you want to turn to the folks at your table and think about, are there things that have come up that have really inspired you, really energized you? Please take about 7 minutes or so. Just talk around your table and think about what are the ideas that have come forward that have really meant something to you. I was wondering if anybody wanted to share things that came up at the table, things that they shared that had personal meaning to them, things that had inspired or reflections they had on the conversation. You want to share? I saw a lot of good conversation.
I'll just say that at the table I was at, people were talking about what I would call the importance of getting involved with a particular area of interest. And, this is advice that is often heard. If you've got money, get involved right there, with whatever that is.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Other things that you heard in conversations, either the panelists or anybody wants to share? People come shy all of a sudden. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, people were talking about different things, so I'm trying to generalize it. But somebody was talking about local services. So philanthropy directed more at local services. And that comes from getting involved. Somebody else was involved in a project in Haiti. And just so that became an area of interest. And it becomes an area of philanthropy. And that's often the advice given to new philanthropists, is to sort of figure out. When I first inherited, I went to a philanthropic advisor. And so our first conversation was, what's your mission statement? And so once I had my mission, everything just sort of like fell into place from there. And then how you go about working with that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great. I just had an interesting question asked to me, which was the question of how does the Vermont ethos, how is this different in Vermont than it might be in other places? Does anybody want to comment on that? How does this idea? I think about a conversation I had last week with a woman who moved here from Virginia, and I mentioned this event. She wasn't able to make it, but one of the things she said to me was that when she was in Virginia, if you weren't involved in a faith community, you really weren't involved in Virginia. I mean, that was her comment. And then she came here, and now she was looking for a faith community, and she said it just felt like you almost don't talk about religion, that's sort of kind of off the table, not appropriate. Bring her to Guilford. Okay, I'll send her here. Yeah. No, but I thought that was interesting. And does that affect us? I mean, as philanthropists or just in our daily life, do we talk about our faith less here, do we think?
I really think it has to do with rugged individualism. Mm-hmm. And I think Vermonters are very individualistic. And there are so many nonprofits and so many ideas, and that people are a little phobic to community unless they feel totally aligned with community. One example can I go on?
Okay. Of course.
I was a little bit worried when CASP was developed. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's the Community Asylum Seekers Project here that brings Latin American refugees, asylum seekers here to this community. And I will admit that I was really cynical about it, because I thought, we have so many refugees, we have migrant workers, why are we bringing people up from the border? Even though I'm very sympathetic to them, of course. And one of the things that I realized that CASP has done really well is it's created a community of support where it's almost like a church. It's almost like a faith community where everybody has some different job, whether they're providing food, whether they're providing housing, whether they're providing rides, and it's just created this whole community. And I think that's the gift of some of these nonprofits. It really gives people a place to find community and not just have their idea. So anyway, that's just a...
Well, I want to build that out a little bit more, because I think this is a space that I'm really interested in, which is, I think everybody in the room, I really feel confident when you say we need to help individuals who are poor, individuals in need. That's pretty easy to say, but it's when we get into these tricky spaces, right? Of we want to help somebody, but politically it's a little uncomfortable. And I think that's what's interesting to me is how faith communities go back and forth on that, and I think often find themselves in some pretty uncomfortable spaces. And I think whether it was in Rutland when a lot of refugee resettlement groups are quite faith communities are very involved in refugee resettlement, and there's decades, there's centuries of history of that, of it welcoming individuals from other places. And I guess I want to go a little bit deeper into that issue of how do we work in those very uncomfortable spaces? Because I think that we face them as philanthropists too. Really easy to give to the food pantry, basically speaking. Gets a little bit harder when you start to give to, I recently had a very intense conversation with a fund holder, and I say intense in a good way. I mean, that's what I like, is when there's this deep conversation, and it was around the question of, access to food, and do you make food universally available in school lunches, because that way you're sure that even if people don't want to speak to their poverty, that they have access to free food. That's a policy choice. It's a little bit political in nature, and that's when we start to get into a very uncomfortable space about what are our real values and how do we make policy that aligns to that value. So I want to kind of push us into those uncomfortable spaces where we're drawing on these very deeply held beliefs about doing good, and then we get kind of frozen sometimes when it starts to be political and difficult, because those are the conversations as communities we're having right now. And that's why I brought up the Martin Luther King one, which is that uncomfortable space about income inequality is another one. Yeah. I saw some lights go off here. Yeah.
So I live in North Bennington. So Bennington County is my home. Mm-hmm. So it's the place I know the best. So I'll just speak from my personal experience there. And I always say of Bennington that it's really a tale of two cities in Bennington. There are people who are struggling but working and doing okay, and there are people who are just fine, and but then there's a fairly significant group of people who are not doing well at all, and you could define them depending on the lens you're taking. You could say they had children when they were very young, they dropped out of school, they are substance users, they're unemployed, they're whatever. There are many ways of sort of looking at that, and I really wonder how to break down those divides really between the two communities. Of course, being a storyteller, I believe in that as a methodology. But I think it's just a question we really all have to ask: is what's the difference between sort of charity and sort of solidarity giving? I feel like there is a real difference in those two things. For me, I'll just tell you, for me, the difference is that, one is transactional and one is reciprocal, I guess, is sort of a very clean way of sort of saying it. That a lot of the work that's done is someone who is in charge of the resources, giving those resources to someone that doesn't have those resources. And that's a relationship that can feel disempowering and infantilizing. And that doesn't lead to necessarily personal change, right? Or, and I'm not saying that reciprocal giving always does, but I think it has more of a chance of doing that, of solidarity giving. And I think that there's a lot to be said for finding ways of providing sustainable resources to people who don't have what they need in a way that builds their confidence, self-esteem, and relationships within the community with others that can help them in different kinds of ways. So that's something I think about a lot, just because I feel like there is a lot of generosity and there is a lot of giving, and yet I wonder why all that giving hasn't transformed more of the social structures that exist. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of these difficult conversations, and this is not just a question for our little Vermont rural communities, it transcends the United States and the world. We've forgotten how to disagree with each other, which is a huge problem. And one of the things I love about studying Talmud is rabbis were paired together intentionally who disagreed with each other. Hillel and Shammai, Rav and Shmuel, and the point was you might be wrong, they might be right, or vice versa, or you would fine-tune your arguments, or you might come up with a compromise. But a different opinion was not something to be crushed. It wasn't the enemy. It made you better in that search for what should be the answer. And we need to learn how to reclaim that in so many different ways.
So how can we do that with philanthropy? Through our giving. Well, I think we think about what we think as funders. What can we fund? What can we support? Are these community dialogues? Are they? We think a lot about information. Sharing information, and then there's Alisa talks about the individual interactions where you learn from somebody's lived experience. But what can we do to be transformative? Because that is that thing we're holding out. When I think about our work to close the opportunity gap, that's partly what we're trying to figure out. How do we help people go from being the recipients of charity to building and be able to reach their full potential? How do we have those hard conversations?
One area is I think we've kind of took democracy for granted, and I think we need to reinvigorate the teaching of civics. And that can both come within the public school system as well as, philanthropy from foundations and organizations to beef that up both within the school and without the school. That would be one area to remind ourselves about that.
Are faith communities doing that? Oh, I'm sorry. You follow up the way you want. You follow up. Yes, please.
Well, I was just thinking about, I had I'm very fresh off an experience that relates a little bit to what they were talking about this challenging the story that you tell each other. I was at a meeting of a place that's called Families United, which is for foster parents who have lost their children into the foster care system. So I know the story about foster children and what they go through. I know we have people in my congregation who are foster parents, and I know what they go through. I had not been in a setting where the people who had lost their children were present, and there was also 2 people who had been caseworkers. And one of the things that occurs to me is I believe, just of course this stems out of my faith, that the children are the key to everything, and families are where like June said, are nurtured. And I almost wonder if having a conversation like this with people who are in a pretty dysfunctional system, Department of Children and Families, or HCRS, people who are doing this work know that there are problems in the system, but they don't have access to what it would take. So, for example, one of the things that they were talking about was the fact that they used to have training for parents who were at risk of losing their children into the foster training, so that they could have steps to take to be able to keep their children. And I'm not talking about substance abuse. I mean, that goes without saying. I'm talking about just ways of being with their children that keep their children safe and allow caseworkers to feel that children are safe. But that funding was cut. So now they have they have this problem, they know they have a problem, they have no access to what it would take to be able to be parents that they want to be. And these are all people in deep grief and also anger, of course, because their children were taken away from them. So when I was kind of taking this in, I was thinking, there are people doing this work that don't have access to resources that would make a difference. So if I had those DCF caseworkers here, they would say, all we need is X, and I'm not even going to, and that would be something you could put in the hands of the people who are actually on the streets. The person who was there last night was saying, some of the times I knew what I was doing was terrible, but I had no other resource. So that would be one thing I would offer up.
You know, one of the methods of restorative justice are circles, which are extremely simple. We've all been in circles. They have a few kind of specific techniques that help keep the circle running in the way that it's meant to be. But they are opportunities very, very low. They don't need a lot of resources. They're a way of bringing diverse people together to build common understanding, reveal shared values, and potentially come up with actionable, things that can actually be done to make the community better. I know that there are initiatives like the Rural Vermont. Sorry, I'm blanking on the name. Paul Costello, which does a sort of a form of bottom-up community organizing, which is really great. But the thing is that the people that don't come to those events are the people that we really should be the most concerned about in our communities. And they're not going to come. They're not going to come given the way that, I'm not criticizing what he does. I'm just saying that that taps the voice of a certain group of our community members. But there's a huge group of people that never get to speak. They never get heard. Except when they're arrested or when their kids are taken away from them, or they, do something horrible and they're on the news. So how do we, for me, this is what I've spent my life trying to figure out. How do we engage that part of our community in a respectful way that builds capacity, that builds relationships? Because, we know it's really all about having relationships that can support you, make you feel understood and known and part of a community. So I think that's something we could think about.
Yeah, so like many people in Vermont, I'm a transplant from New Jersey. And I grew up in Ewing, and one of the great things about the education system there, we had this thing called value clarification exercises. We did it from basically K through 12, and it's one of the greatest gifts I was ever given. Because basically, if you disagree with somebody, they're coming with a value. And you have a value. And if you can place the conversation there I'm trying to understand your value, and I want you to understand my value. That changes the whole tenor of what the conversation looks like. And so I think that's another way of getting through some of these more difficult conversations.
Right. I want to keep following up on that. I think what I know in this room and on this panel are people who've done some really amazing projects, some things that have worked and that have come together. And, a few have been mentioned, but I want to keep piling on and looking for those inspiring stories. I think, Lise, did we once talk about, some of you know the Corporation for National Community Service has a faith-based and community initiative. It's called something like that. And I think, weren't you involved with one with youth services at one point?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I think there are things that have come together that have gone really well, and I think we want to get those.
Oh gosh.
You just brightened
I can't
up.
believe I didn't talk about that earlier. You were wanting me to do that. I'm so sorry. Oh gosh. I will be really quick. What's it called? But it was so great. Changed the course of human events in Brattleboro. Some funding that came through George Bush, the younger, for youth at risk. And one of the requirements, first, they allowed faith communities to participate. Thank you. And then so it was Guilford Community Church, Youth Services, Boys and Girls Club, the Commons newspaper, and Insight Photography. They provided us with opportunities they forced us to get together and talk to each other, which was fine with me. And then they also would do training on what are called, I want to call them assets. I think that's what they were called. They're called competencies sometimes, but just of what works with youth programming. And for a period of 3 years, we created programming together. So one of the things that came out of it was the Boys and Girls Club provided meals for high schoolers. The kids that were on the street. Youth Services had street people who could provide condoms and other information about meals to kids. And Guilford Church did a summer youth employment program where some of the kids that were most at risk would come for 6 weeks, have fun, but also go out and help elders in the Guilford community paint their barns, clean this out. The kids loved it. The elders were over the top. It was just one of those moments and the relationships that were created, you can hear my enthusiasm, but it really was amazing. It created relationships so that I knew the people who were working with youth. And if I had something or a youth, I knew what the programming was. They knew me. They knew what I was doing. It was a collaboration that I really think had a tremendous impact. And it had to do with just giving organizations the opportunity to be together. They didn't fund any of the programs. They just funded us being together and helping us find funding if we needed it.
Tell me some other success stories. You on the panel, or if there's folks in the audience who have a story like that of just a project where faith communities and others. There's so many really good projects out there. Move on. Please, Greg, tell.
This is about a.
Could you identify yourself? Thank you, Greg.
My voice last. I'm Greg Moschetti. I live in Dummerston. So some years ago, there were a few of us in a Quaker meeting in New Haven, Connecticut, who thought it would be a good idea to start a Quaker school. I'm going to try to make this short. We went out to the community, and the community said, the last thing we need in New Haven is another private school. What we really need is daycare. And what we really need is infant toddler daycare. So we said, oh, okay, that's what we'll do. And then we went to the experts and they said, you'll never do it. You will never do it. It's too expensive to do infant toddler. It just won't work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we labored in the lower level of the meeting house, I think for about, I'm going to say 7 or 8 years, and finally started this little fledgling program with 18 children. That program today has 180 children. It's about to double in size in the next 2 years with satellite locations. We built a brand new state-of-the-art child education center. Now, how did that all happen? Well, I think one way it happened was that we really felt we were led to do this work. And it took us, I think, quite a while to realize we couldn't do it alone. So we started to reach out to various people that we knew had means. We started reaching out to the state of Connecticut, and eventually it just all came together, partly because we found the right director to pull us forward from where we were at. So I think that's just a wonderful success story. The nature of this child care center is amazing. It is totally focused on values-based education. It is totally focused on social justice. We have a non-majoritarian admissions policy. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So quite proud, but also just quite grateful that this came together.
Yeah, that's an amazing story of commitment and tenacity and drive, and that's remarkable. And coming together in partnership. Thank you. I know there are others in this room. Thank you, Greg. I want to hear more about your environmental justice work. Yep, Rabbi.
Okay. So it's not easy. We do it with Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians, Christian, Muslims, and Jews, and in a very volatile area that we call the Holy Land, which is interesting. So the way that it works for a number of reasons. One is, too often when you bring people together who are in disagreement, particularly in that part of the world, you might get them together once a month, maybe for a few weeks in the summer. These students are together for 24/7 for a minimum of 4 months, if not a full year. And if they do a graduate program, they're together for another 2 years. So we have the luxury of time, which means you don't have to deal with everything immediately. We have sessions called PELS, Peace Building Environmental Leadership Seminar, where we shove the conflict down everyone's throats. And they leave those sessions hurt, screaming, and angry. But they know they have the time to work it through. So a week later, you can then go up to Muhammad and say, you really pissed me off. But what did you mean by that? Or to Shulamit. So time is a luxury that we don't often have. That's really, really important. You also get to know, you also have different touch points. You don't just want people meeting over conflict. You want them meeting over, they're sharing classes together and foods and holidays and religion and music, and they get to each know each other's people, which builds trust. If you trust somebody, you can imagine going forward even if you disagree with somebody. And that is so key in how you transform relationships like that. It's also in the middle of the desert. It's away from contested areas. It's very, very quiet in the desert. It's on a kibbutz that understands communal living. And then you have the environment itself, which in one ways, when you look at the environment from the perspective of geopolitics, you see lines, borders, walls, and conflict. When we look at that exact same piece of real estate, if you will, from the perspective of the environment, that completely changes. All those divisions are wiped away, and you're not just invited, you're forced to work with the other. So that which is the problem in some ways becomes the opening to the solution. So it's how do you look at things from different angles, and being creative in that process. So it's also being very intentional. Yes, we're going to bring these people together and we're going to make all of these changes and bring justice to the world, which sounds great, but we really have to think through how does one do that? And not just in this area as well, but in so many different areas if we're going to be effective and succeed.
I really had no idea where this conversation was going to go today. And I think it's finally sort of coming together to me. I'm really, really hearing these themes, and I don't know if other people are hearing them as well, which is what it really comes down to. We keep talking about this need for connecting to people, this need to have this first is sort of building trust and building ourselves and to be strong and to understand what we really believe and what we really value. And then it's figuring out how to do that with everybody else. And whether it's like in your case, Greg, of you were heading the same direction and it was still really hard to figure it out and get through the system and make it work, or whether you're not sure you're at all heading the same direction in a situation and having to really work through a lot of conflict, or you're unpacking stuff like you've been doing, Alisa, on deep pain and people who have wounded each other or their own actions have wounded their lives and the people in their lives, and getting through that awful mess and pain and trying to get to another place. And we're just trying to figure out here as we think about how do we exist in that space as donors is what can we do to push that forward. And what I hear is, yes, you can do that direct action, but it's being brave enough to do, what did you say, 8 years that it took to get, a daycare off the ground, or engaging or taking, getting involved in a space-based and community initiative and just seeing it through to the end, your lifetime of working on domestic violence. But I think that's the sort of theme I'm hearing a lot, is sort of keeping in there and trying to push forward through those uncomfortable spaces and getting to the other side.
I would take
Yeah.
exception to
Oh.
brave.
Oh, okay.
I think
Yeah.
that it wasn't bravery. It was more feeling led to do it, led by, in Quaker terms, by the light.
Yeah.
To do it. And so it didn't feel brave. Doesn't feel brave.
You know, I'm so glad you said that, because that's sort of where we started, right? The conversation today was, why did we decide to come together and see if we could have a conversation like this? And it was because people when we go and talk to fund holders and donors and people around the community foundation, they always talk about beliefs and values, and they're just trying to figure out how to do it. And you're right. I don't think people do think of it as brave, as so much as I need to do this because it's the right thing to do, and it's so deeply in my soul and my heart to be in this space, and I'm just trying to do it better and better or more and make it happen, and that's where we come together. So I want to wind down the conversation, but I'm going to look to the panels for some last comments on your takeaways. What question did I not ask you, or what thought did you not have a chance to share as we've been talking today? Whoever would like to start first.
So there was one you asked about whether anonymous giving or whether we should, have our name out there.
Yeah.
And so I found this wonderful little ditty from this Larry David HBO show. It goes, you quote Torah or Larry David, then you're covered, right, in this world. In an episode of a popular HBO sitcom, the main character, Larry David, attends an event where he is celebrated for donating a museum wing. There he finds out his arch nemesis, Ted Danson, has also donated a museum wing, but his donation is marked as anonymous. Everyone at the event, including Larry's wife, begins to praise Ted for donating anonymously. A furious Larry exclaims, "No one told me I could be anonymous and tell people." And I think it goes to the tension of how should we give? And there are pluses and minuses to both. They're really authentic pluses and minuses to both. And it's, where we land comfortably, whether we want to influence others, that we hope if we give by having our name out there, or just because we feel good about it, or because we don't want to be in the limelight and we don't want other people knocking on our door. But they're both right. But I think this little episode really points to there's no right answer necessarily.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And the interesting thing about that too is that there's the adage to give anonymously is a higher form of giving, but the other one is that to walk side by and to lend your power and your privilege and your opportunity to others is also a gift, to give somebody a job or to help them directly. So talk a little bit more about that, because that is a sort of interesting dilemma. I don't know if there's a right answer, but there's certainly some thought on that.
Well, part of I started out as an anonymous giver in many places, but then, reading through the list of donors for some annual report or other, it's like I'm inspired by the names of the people I recognize. So I stopped being anonymous, even though it's the anonymity is considered to be a higher form of giving. It's but I think part of that is like how much ego. I think the root question there is partly how much ego is involved. Like, I gave the wing, but or this is a possibility, and look, it inspired somebody else.
Yeah, and to push to higher levels of giving. That's right. That's part of, we have philanthropists out there. There's ocean of tithing, right? So some say you should give 10% of your income. Some now they're philanthropists who are saying they should give away all of their wealth or almost all of their wealth, and they are saying it publicly to say to others, why are you sitting on it? Okay, so that's sort of an interesting question. Again, Faith will talk about that if we want to refer some of those. Again, you talked about commandments about giving. Is this a commandment or is this kind of a choice?
Right. Well, again, I was early on in my philanthropic life, which is about 20 years. I was really inspired by, at that time, it was called Boulder Giving. People giving away spectacular amounts of money. Like, you could, be part of it if you'd give it away 50% of your assets. It's like, whoa, there are people out there who do that. It's a possibility. And because one of the things I'm often looking at is the amount of stress in my life, the amount of stress that goes with managing money. It's like, if I gave it away, I don't have to pay the portfolio fees. I don't have to go meet with that portfolio guy. Let somebody else take care of it. Much more relaxing.
Love it.
Well, I just come from the other side. I've been raising money my whole life for the work I do. And I guess I want to just comment on the really powerful relationships. Sorry to be the relationship person here, but that I've been able, that I've had the privilege to develop with some of the individuals or foundation professionals who've believed in not only the work I was doing, but believed in me. And I just want to make a pitch for sustainable funding, because as someone who has had to do this, the difficult thing is to have a long vision, have a long-term vision, but then constantly having to repackage my vision to make it the new thing, and it is demoralizing as the sort of person trying to get the money to make the impact, but it is also it sort of prevents the long arc from really being fruitful, and so I just want to make a point to say that relationships between the fund, the giver and the recipient can be really powerful relationships, and that thinking longer term without these minute benchmarks can be really liberating and really and produce more creativity, I think, in the work. So I just want to make a pitch for that.
Do you want to say something? Yep.
Just a little bit of we always the poor end of the spectrum here. I have two things, as always, to say. One is we have just done a capital campaign at our church, and Groundworks Collaborative is about to do a capital campaign. And one thing that I know, not being a philanthropist, is that when an organization gets to the point where they can do a capital campaign, that's a time when your money goes a really long way. The shift in what our church is in terms of the environment and in terms of our solidity and our sustainability, now that we have a completed capital campaign, is astounding. And frankly, all the years we've poured into the overflow shelter are coming to fruition. They're about to build an overflow shelter that's permanent. So it's a critical moment. And I would say, if you were trying to do something, kind of use one marker, I would say capital campaigns are a sign that at some place is got it together, they have a vision, and they need the money, and it'll really go to good use. So that would be one thing I would say. The other, I wanted to just echo what Alisa just said to a certain extent, is that, and it also goes to Greg, is that I would think, I mean, I'm just going to be talking as a pastor now, but one of the things I know in my congregation is that if somebody is excited about something to the extent that they are willing to put their energy into it, that's where I say, okay, let's go ahead. A lot of people have ideas, but if I don't see that they're the one who's going to go and change our whole recycling system themselves, it just floats off into the horizon. And I think there's this issue of a resonance between somebody feeling the light, seeing the light, feeling and a resonance with a person is something to watch for. It's one thing to have an organization that you're interested in, but if you see a leader in that organization that has that courage to live it out, that's a good place to invest. I do that on a very small scale at the church, but I suspect if I had money, I'd be looking around for people who embody the thing it is that you resonate with.
And yeah, so I was just saying at the small table discussion, I often consider my philanthropy as an investment in leadership. I'm investing in the leadership of that organization. And as we all know, sometimes a new leader comes in and the organization goes off that way, and it's like, oh, I really liked what you were doing, but it's not a match anymore. So, bye.
Well, here's what I'm appreciating so much. The gratitude right now is, we talked about beliefs and values. We've talked about the relationships we build. And to me, what we've come at the end here and talked about, really it is the people who do the work in the community, whether it's bringing people together in conversation, doing community service, social activism, preserving land, all the many things that we care about, building an arts and culture community, that is people. And, we think about that relationship. We talked about faith and philanthropy here, and philanthropos, the love of humankind, which is philanthropy. And that's why we're here. That's where all came to hear and to come together to talk. And I thank you so much to the panelists, Rabbi Michael Cohen, Alisa Del Tufo, Reverend Dr. Lise Sparrow, Cheryl Wilfong, for being our panelists, sharing your thoughts, your ideas, inspiring us. And I very much thank all of you who are here, some who came around the corner, some who came some pretty long distances through, in some cases, snow. So thank you so much for being here.
I'd like to just say one piece of advice. I was a member of a philanthropic, women's philanthropic organization for some years. And one woman said, her mother said, just keep adding zeros. So sometimes I feel like I can't quite add that zero. So it's like, can I double that number that's at the front? Can I triple the number? So in lieu of adding zeros. Yeah.
I like that. I'm loving that.
And how about we thank Elizabeth for putting this together?
Oh, thank you for all being here.